Welcome to Books Podcast. Join us for quick, insightful book reviews and summaries that inspire and inform. Don't forget to subscribe and never miss an episode. Today we're taking a deep dive into a book one of you suggested,
Oh, yeah.
The Art of Strategy, a game theorist's guide to success in business and life by Avinash K, Dixit and Barry J, Nalebuff.
Okay.
And get this, it's not just about boardrooms and business deals.
Interesting.
This book uses game theory to break down everyday stuff, from negotiating chores with your roommate to finally figuring out why your friend always wins at poker.
Well, it's all about choices, really. Game theory helps us understand that our choices are intertwined with the choices others make.
Okay.
Think of it as a giant game of chess, where every move ripples across the board, affecting everyone's outcome.
Okay, so it's less about being a mastermind and more about anticipating how other people will react to our moves, right?
Exactly. The Art of Strategy starts by laying a solid foundation, introducing a tool called the payoff matrix. It's like a map that visually plots out your choices and the potential consequences, good or bad, based on what others decide to do.
So it's like having a cheat sheet for navigating those tricky situations where you're trying to figure out the best move.
Yes.
Give us an example from the book that really brings this to life.
Imagine you're at an auction eyeing that vintage vinyl you've always wanted.
Okay.
The payoff matrix helps you visualize the different scenarios. Do you bid aggressively and risk overpaying, or do you play it cool and risk losing out to another bidder? It lays out those possibilities, helping you make a smarter, more calculated bid.
That's super practical.
Yeah.
But the book goes way beyond auctions, right?
Oh, absolutely. It delves into some core concepts that apply to all sorts of situations.
Like what?
Take dominant strategies, for instance.
Okay.
It's about identifying choices that are always the best, no matter what your opponent or the other players do.
So it's like having a secret weapon that guarantees you'll come out on top no matter what the circumstances.
You got it. And then there's the famous Nash equilibrium.
Okay.
It's like finding that sweet spot in a game where everyone is making the best possible choice given what everyone else is doing. No one has an incentive to switch things up because any change would lead to a worse outcome for them.
That sounds a bit abstract.
Yeah.
Can you give us a real-world example from the book so we can wrap our heads around it?
They use the example of a penalty kick in soccer. The kicker wants to score, the goalie wants to block the shot. If they both randomly choose left or right, it creates a kind of balance. But if one can predict the other's move based on their tendencies or past behavior, that balance shifts, giving one a clear advantage.
It's a perfect illustration. And the art of strategy doesn't just throw these fancy terms at you. It gives you actual strategies to use them.
That's the beauty of it. The authors take us beyond theory and dive into practical applications. One of the big ones is the power of commitment and credibility.
Right. It's about being able to back up your words with actions, or even intentionally limiting your own options to show you're serious.
Yes.
Wasn't there an example in the book about a business making a bold move?
They talk about a company that publicly announces a massive investment in a new product. By going all in and making it public, they're essentially drawing a line in the sand, deterring competitors from even thinking about entering the market.
So it's like a power move that says, we're not messing around, so don't even try to compete with us.
Precisely. That unwavering commitment creates a strategic advantage, but it's not enough to just talk the talk. You have to walk the walk. Your commitment has to be credible for it to have any real impact.
Which makes me think about those friends who are always making big promises but never follow through. Eventually, you just stop believing them, right?
Right.
You need actions to back up those words.
Absolutely. And this concept of credibility isn't just for CEOs in boardrooms.
No.
Think about negotiating with your landlord over rent. If you constantly waffle or change your stance, you lose your leverage.
But isn't there a time for flexibility, too? What about adapting to new information or unexpected situations?
Sure.
How does that fit in with this idea of commitment?
That's a great question. The Art of Strategy tackles that head-on, exploring the tension between cooperation and competition. It's about recognizing when it's strategically advantageous to join forces and when you need to stand your ground and fight for your interests.
Like sometimes it's better to work together and share the pie, and sometimes you have to grab the biggest slice you can.
Exactly. The book uses real-world examples like a pricing war between companies. If both companies keep slashing prices to undercut each other, they both end up losing profits in the long run.
Makes sense.
But if they can find a way to cooperate, maybe through strategic alliances or agreements, they can actually maintain higher prices and benefit collectively.
It's that whole if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together thing.
You nailed it. And the art of strategy gives you the tools to analyze those situations and figure out when to collaborate and when to compete.
Okay, we've covered some of the foundations, the payoff matrix, dominant strategies, the Nash equilibrium.
Right.
Are we ready to dive a little deeper into the world of game theory?
Let's do it. The book doesn't shy away from more advanced stuff like mixed strategies, which is all about embracing the power of unpredictability.
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting. I remember this section. It's like throwing a curveball to keep your opponent guessing.
Exactly. If you're too predictable, your rivals will figure you out and use it to their advantage. The book uses the example of bluffing in poker. If you only bluff when you have a weak hand, your opponents will catch on. But if you mix it up sometimes, bluffing with a strong hand, you create uncertainty and throw them off their game.
So it's about keeping your opponents on their toes, right?
Precisely. Think about negotiating a salary. If your potential employer knows exactly what you're willing to accept, they have the upper hand.
Oh, I see.
But if you keep them guessing, you have more leverage.
I'm starting to see how being unpredictable can be a real asset.
Yeah.
Maybe this explains why I always lose at poker.
Well, the key is not just to be random for the sake of being random. It's about understanding the probabilities and the potential outcomes of each choice.
So there's a real art to this art of strategy, right?
Definitely.
It's about more than just crunching numbers or memorizing formulas.
Exactly. It's about understanding human behavior psychology and the nuances of decision-making.
And the book doesn't just stay in the realm of poker games and business deals, right?
No.
It explores how these concepts play out in our personal lives, too.
Absolutely. The art of strategy encourages us to use game theory as a lens for understanding all sorts of everyday interactions, like splitting chores with roommates or figuring out what movie to watch with your family.
That's so cool. It's like a whole new way of looking at the world.
Exactly. It opens up your mind to new possibilities and helps you navigate those everyday dilemmas with more awareness and strategy. One thing that keeps coming back to me as we delve deeper into the art of strategy is how much of our lives is actually influenced by game theory, even if we don't realize it. It's like we're constantly playing these mini games in our interactions with others.
So true.
Yeah.
Before reading this book, I never would have thought of things like deciding where to eat with friends or splitting chores as strategic decisions.
Right.
But they totally are.
Exactly. Everyone has their own preferences and motivations.
Yeah.
And the more we understand the principles of game theory, the better we can navigate those group dynamics. It's like having this secret decoder ring to understand why people do the things they do.
I'm loving this decoder ring analogy. But the book makes it clear that this isn't about manipulating people, right?
Oh, no.
It's about understanding their motivations so we can cooperate or compete more effectively.
You're spot on. And speaking of cooperation, one of the most intriguing concepts the book explores is the prisoner's dilemma.
Oh, yeah. I remember that.
It's a classic example of how sometimes making what seems like the best choice for ourselves can actually lead to a worse outcome for everyone involved.
I remember this one being a real mind bender. Can you walk us through how the prisoner's dilemma works again?
Absolutely. Imagine two suspects have been arrested for a crime. They're being held in separate cells and can't communicate with each other.
Fine.
The police offer each suspect a deal. If one confesses and rats out their partner, they go free while the other gets a long sentence. If both confess, they both get a moderate sentence. But if both stay silent and remain loyal to each other, they both get a light sentence.
So the best outcome for both of them is to keep quiet.
Right.
But there's this huge temptation to betray the other person, right?
Exactly. Because if you stay silent, you run the risk of your partner confessing and leaving you holding the bag.
Oh, yeah.
Which means you get the worst possible outcome. So the rational choice for each individual suspect is to confess even though it leads to a worse outcome for both of them collectively. It's a real catch-22.
This dilemma highlights just how important trust and communication are. If the prisoners could talk to each other and agree to stay quiet, they'd both be better off.
That's a crucial insight. The prisoner's dilemma isn't just some theoretical puzzle.
No.
It plays out in real-world scenarios all the time. Think about things like arms races between countries.
Oh, wow.
Each country feels compelled to build up its weapons out of fear, even though it ultimately makes everyone less safe.
Right.
Or companies polluting to maximize profits, even though it harms the environment in the long run.
So how do we break free from these prisoner's dilemma traps?
Yeah.
How do we create a system where people choose to cooperate, even when it feels risky?
The art of strategy offers some really interesting solutions.
Okay.
One is to establish mechanisms that encourage cooperation, like international treaties or environmental regulations.
Makes sense.
These create a framework where there are consequences for acting selfishly. Another solution is to foster a culture of trust and reciprocity. If people believe that others will cooperate, they're more likely to cooperate themselves.
So it's about building a system where people are rewarded for working together and there are consequences for betraying that trust.
That's the essence of it. It's about shifting the incentives so that cooperation becomes the most rational choice.
This is all so fascinating, but I have to admit my brain is starting to hurt a little trying to keep up with all these strategic concepts.
I can imagine.
Is it normal to feel like your mind is doing gymnastics while reading this book?
I think that's a common experience. Game theory can be complex, but what makes the art of strategy so brilliant is the way the authors make these ideas accessible and engaging.
Yeah.
There's real-world examples, relatable scenarios, even pop culture references to illustrate the principles.
I love that they bring in things like game shows or movie plots.
Right.
It makes the concepts click because you can see how they play out in situations you're already familiar with.
Exactly. It helps to demystify game theory and show that it's not just some abstract academic exercise.
Right.
It's woven into the fabric of our lives, whether we're consciously aware of it or not.
So what are some key takeaways from the art of strategy that our listeners can start applying in their own lives, even if they're not CEOs or master chess players?
One of the most important takeaways is to always think a few steps ahead. Don't just react to the situation in front of you, but anticipate how others might respond to your actions.
It's like playing chess. You can't just focus on making your own move.
Right.
You have to consider all the possible counter moves your opponent might make.
Precisely. And another key takeaway is to try to put yourself in the other person's shoes. What are their motivations? What are their goals? Understanding their perspective will help you predict their behavior and make more informed decisions.
It's like that classic advice to seek first to understand, then to be understood.
That's a great way to put it. And finally, don't be afraid to experiment and adapt. The world is constantly changing.
Right.
And the most effective strategies are often those that are flexible and responsive to new information.
So be strategic, be empathetic, and be adaptable. Those are some great guiding principles.
Those are great guiding principles. And remember, game theory is a toolbox. It's up to you to decide which tools to use and how to apply them effectively in different situations.
I love that. It's not about memorizing a bunch of formulas. It's about developing a strategic mindset,
Right.
a way of approaching challenges with more awareness and intention. I'm curious, what are some of the tools from the art of strategy that you found most useful in your own life?
Where one tool that I use all the time is the idea of backward induction.
Backward induction.
It's about starting with your desired outcome and then working backward, figuring out the steps you need to take to get there.
That sounds super practical. Can you give us an example of how you've used backward induction in a real-life situation?
Sure. Let's say I'm trying to negotiate a raise at work. I start by thinking about what salary I want to be making, and then I work backward, figuring out what arguments I need to make, what evidence I need to present, and how I need to frame my requests to achieve that goal. It helps me to stay focused and strategic throughout the negotiation process.
That's a brilliant example.
Thanks.
I can see how that would be incredibly helpful in all sorts of situations, not just salary negotiations.
Exactly. It's a versatile tool that can be applied to everything from planning a vacation to launching a new business.
This is giving me so many ideas. I feel like I'm seeing the world in a whole new light thanks to the art of strategy. But I'm wondering, we've talked a lot about how these concepts apply in business negotiations, personal relationships, even international relations. Are there any areas where game theory doesn't really apply? Are there any limits to its usefulness?
That's a great question. Game theory is a powerful tool, but it's not a magic bullet.
Right.
It's important to remember that it's based on certain assumptions about human behavior, rationality, and self-interest.
Okay.
In reality, people don't always act in perfectly rational ways.
True.
And there are often factors at play that go beyond pure self-interest, emotions, ethics, social norms, and so on.
So it's important to use game theory as a framework for understanding,
Yes.
but not as a rigid set of rules that dictates our every move.
Exactly. It's about being aware of the potential biases and limitations of the model
Right.
and using our judgment and intuition to adapt it to real-world situations.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I'm armed with a whole new set of tools to navigate the world more strategically. But I'm curious what happens when we encounter people who aren't playing by the same rules. What if someone is deliberately trying to manipulate or exploit us using game theory tactics?
That's a really important question, and it highlights the ethical dimension of game theory. Like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad.
So how do we protect ourselves from being manipulated? How do we make sure we're using these tools ethically and responsibly?
The art of strategy touches on this by emphasizing the importance of understanding the different types of games and the motivations of the players. Are we dealing with a zero-sum game where one person's gain is another person's loss? Or is it a cooperative game where everyone can benefit?
Okay.
Recognizing the type of game we're in helps us to choose the right strategies.
So it's about being aware of the dynamics at play and making sure we're not getting caught in a game we don't want to be playing.
Exactly. And it's also about developing our own ethical compass.
Right.
Game theory can help us to analyze situations and make strategic decisions, but ultimately, it's up to us to choose how we want to use that knowledge.
It's like having a superpower, but also having the responsibility to use it wisely.
That's a great analogy. Game theory gives us incredible insights into human behavior and decision-making, but it's up to us to wield that power ethically and responsibly.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of the art of strategy.
There's so much more to explore. You know, as we wrap up our deep dive into the art of strategy, one thing that keeps coming back to me is the importance of challenging our assumptions. Game theory pushes us to think beyond our own limited perspective and to consider all the angles, even those that might be uncomfortable or counterintuitive.
It's like those optical illusions where you're convinced you're seeing one thing, but then you shift your perspective and realize it's something else entirely.
Exactly.
Game theory helps us to avoid those mental blind spots and to see the world in a new light.
It's about recognizing that our own intuition can sometimes lead us astray. We might think we know the best course of action, but game theory encourages us to step outside of ourselves and see the situation from multiple viewpoints.
And that can be so powerful, especially in situations where there's conflict or disagreement. If we can understand where the other person is coming from, it becomes much easier to find common ground, or at least to negotiate more effectively.
Absolutely. And I think that's why The Art of Strategy is such a valuable book, even for people who aren't interested in business or economics. It teaches us how to think more strategically about all aspects of our lives, from our personal relationships to our careers to our interactions with the world around us.
It's like a life hack for better decision-making.
Yeah.
But it's not just about following a set of rules or formulas, right?
Yeah. No.
It's about developing a mindset, a way of thinking that can be applied to any situation.
You got it. It's not about memorizing a playbook. It's about understanding the underlying principles and then using your own creativity and judgment to adapt them to the specific circumstances.
And that's what makes it so empowering. It's about becoming a more thoughtful and strategic player in the game of life.
I love that analogy.
Me too.
And speaking of games, one of the concepts that really blew my mind was the idea of mixed strategies, basically the art of being unpredictable.
Oh, yeah.
I never thought of randomness as a strategy,
Me neither.
but the book makes a compelling case for it.
Right. It seems counterintuitive. We're often told to be consistent and reliable. But sometimes the most effective approach is to keep people guessing. The book used that great example of penalty kicks in soccer,
Yes.
where the kicker is more likely to score if they randomly choose which way to shoot.
Exactly. If the goalie knows the kicker always aims for the left corner, they can easily anticipate the shot. But if the kicker mixes things up, it becomes much harder to predict. And that creates a strategic advantage.
So it's not just about being random for the sake of being random. It's
Yeah.
about being strategically unpredictable.
Oh, precisely. It's about finding that sweet spot between following a plan and being adaptable, between sticking to your guns and being open to new information.
That's a really helpful way to think about it. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the art of strategy, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I'd say the most important thing to remember is that game theory is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad. It's up to us to use it wisely and ethically. It's not just about winning at all costs. It's about making decisions that benefit not just ourselves, but also the people around us.
That's such an important reminder. Game theory can help us to make better decisions, but it's not a license to be manipulative or selfish. Ultimately, it's up to us to use our judgment and our values to guide our choices. Thanks for listening to Books Podcast. Enjoyed this episode. Subscribe and share with fellow book lovers.
Got a book suggestion? Let us know. Happy reading.